You're walking through gilded corridors in the heart of Madrid, 1690. You've been summoned to meet the most powerful monarch in Europe, the king whose empire stretches across 3 continents, whose word can start wars, whose bloodline has ruled for 200 years. The doors swing open, and what you see makes your breath catch in your throat. The figure before you cannot close his mouth. His jaw hangs open like a gate torn from its hinges. When he tries to speak, only wet, garbled sounds emerge, something between words and drowning. His body is so twisted, so wrong, that for a moment you wonder if this is some cruel jest, if the real king is hidden somewhere behind a curtain. But the courtiers bow. The guards salute, and you realize with creeping horror that this broken thing before you is Charles II, King of Spain, ruler of the greatest empire on earth. Before we go deeper into this story, I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching from. It's still astonishing to me that we can explore these centuries-old mysteries together, connected across continents by our shared fascination with the past. Charles II was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His own people believed he was possessed by demons. Foreign ambassadors left his presence shaking, unable to reconcile what they'd seen with the majesty they'd expected. But Charles wasn't cursed by supernatural forces. He was cursed by something far more insidious, far more human, his own family tree. Or rather, the absence of one. Because Charles II didn't have a family tree. He had a family wreath, a closed circle where the same names appeared again and again, in different positions, creating not a lineage but a genetic trap that had been tightening for 2 centuries. To understand how Europe's mightiest dynasty produced this broken king, we have to go back to the Habsburg obsession that made it inevitable. For generations, the Habsburg family had ruled half the known world. Their empire sprawled from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to the Philippines. The sun never set on Habsburg lands, and they were absolutely determined to keep it that way. But their strategy for maintaining power wasn't military might or political genius. It was marriage. Specifically, marriage within their own family. The Habsburgs developed a philosophy they called keeping the bloodline pure. It wasn't enough to marry nobility. They had to marry each other, uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin. And when those relationships became too tangled to track, they simply created new ones. They believed their blood was sacred, superior, blessed by God himself. Mixing it with outsiders would dilute their divine right to rule. So, generation after generation, they married closer and closer relatives, concentrating power, and concentrating something else they didn't understand: genetic mutations. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, he was the product of 11 consecutive generations of intermarriage. 11. Think about your own family tree. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents. Charles should have had 32 great-great-great-grandparents. He had only 10. Some individuals appeared multiple times in his lineage. Simultaneously, his grandmother and his aunt, his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather. Modern geneticists have calculated that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than if his parents had been full siblings. His genetic diversity was lower than that of many purebred dogs. The Habsburgs weren't ignorant of what they were doing. Court records from the 1500s show physicians warning about the dangers. Advisors noticed the pattern. With each generation, children were born weaker, stranger, more prone to illness and deformity. The famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that became the family's trademark, was growing more pronounced with each marriage. Fertility was declining. Infant mortality was rising. The warning signs were everywhere. But the family's response was always the same: marry closer, not further. Their terror of sharing power was greater than their fear of biological consequences. When Charles was born on November 6, 1661, the midwives fell silent. No one celebrated. No bells rang across Madrid. Instead, whispers spread through the palace like a dark stain. The child was so deformed that many thought he'd been born dead. His head was grotesquely oversized, his eyes set so far apart they seemed to belong to different faces. And his mouth, already his mouth hung open, frozen in a gape that would define and torment his entire life. The court went into crisis mode. Midwives were threatened with execution if they spoke of what they'd seen. Doctors were forced to sign declarations that the prince was healthy and normal. Painters were commissioned to create portraits that used every trick of light and angle to make Charles appear almost human. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting that the Habsburg strategy, the very foundation of their power, was destroying them from within. Charles's childhood was a catalogue of missed milestones. He couldn't hold up his own head until he was 6 years old. Most babies achieved this at 3 months. He couldn't walk until he was 8. Most children walk by their first birthday. He couldn't speak intelligibly until he was 10, and even then his words came out as wet, slurred sounds that required interpretation. Palace servants drew lots to determine who would have to care for him. Wet nurses quit in terror. Guards reported hearing strange sounds from his chambers at night. Not quite crying, not quite human. But here's the most heartbreaking detail preserved in court records. Charles seemed to understand. He would stare at his reflection in polished surfaces with an expression that witnesses described as profound sadness. He knew he was different. He knew people were afraid of him. But his limited mental capacity couldn't process why, couldn't articulate the questions that must have haunted him. By the time Charles reached adulthood, if you can call it that, his condition had become impossible to hide. The Habsburg jaw that had been a family trait in previous generations reached its absolute catastrophic peak in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that even when he attempted to close his mouth, there was a gap several inches wide. Modern medical experts examining historical records and portraits believe Charles suffered from severe mandibular prognathism, combined with macroglossia, an enlarged tongue, and possibly acromegaly caused by his genetic makeup. His teeth didn't align at all. The upper row sat completely behind the lower row. Chewing was physiologically impossible. Every meal became a grotesque ordeal. Palace kitchens had to prepare all his food as liquid or paste. Everything mashed to the consistency of baby food. But even then, eating was a disaster. Food would leak from the corners of his mouth. His enlarged tongue would push things back out. Royal dinners, which should have been displays of imperial majesty, became humiliating spectacles where servants constantly dabbed drool from their king's chin while foreign diplomats tried not to stare. Charles was acutely aware of how disgusting he appeared to others. He often refused to eat in public, preferring hunger to humiliation. This led to severe malnutrition, which further weakened his already failing body. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the king's mouth hangs perpetually open, like a fish pulled from water, gasping its final breaths. The French envoy described his speech as the sound a drowning man might make if trying to speak underwater. But the jaw was just the most visible symptom of Charles's comprehensive genetic catastrophe. His entire body was wrong. At 35 years old, he looked like a sick child who'd been stretched and broken. He stood barely 5 feet tall, but his proportions were nightmarish. An oversized head on a stick-thin neck, skeletal limbs, a hunched and twisted spine. His skin was pale and covered in unexplained rashes. His hair grew in thin patches that fell out regularly. Multiple court documents reference a strange odor that surrounded him. Not exactly unpleasant, but unsettling, like something rotting from the inside. Modern doctors suggest this could have been the result of metabolic disorders caused by his extreme inbreeding. And here's where Charles's personal tragedy became a continental disaster. The King of Spain, ruler of history's greatest empire, was completely impotent. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that court physicians described them as infantile. Charles had the sexual maturity of a child trapped in a failing adult body. He married twice, desperately trying to produce an heir. Both marriages were disasters. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, arrived from France expecting to marry a king. The wedding night was catastrophic. Palace servants testified that Marie-Louise emerged in tears while Charles appeared confused and distressed. But the Spanish court couldn't admit their king's condition. It would have been political suicide. So they blamed her instead. She was subjected to humiliating examinations, forced to drink foul herbal concoctions, underwent painful treatments, all to cure her infertility. The psychological toll destroyed her. She died at 26 under mysterious circumstances. Some historians suspect suicide. When medical science failed, the Spanish court turned to the supernatural. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in royal history: public exorcisms performed on a living king. Father Antonio Alvarez de Argüelles, the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles was possessed by multiple demons placed there through witchcraft directed against Spain. These weren't quiet ceremonies in hidden chapels. These were theatrical productions held in the throne room, with nobles and foreign ambassadors forced to watch their king writhing on the floor while priests screamed Latin incantations over his convulsing body. Father Argüelles would force Charles to drink holy water mixed with ground-up religious relics. The king would immediately vomit, likely from drinking dirty water filled with bone fragments, which the priests interpreted as demons fighting the holy substances. The sessions could last hours, with Charles subjected to aggressive physical manipulation as priests literally tried to wrestle demons from his flesh. They pressed crucifixes against his skin until he screamed. They splashed him with holy water. They forced him to recite prayers in a language he could barely comprehend. Charles underwent over 50 formal exorcisms in the last 5 years of his life. Each one left him weaker and more mentally disturbed. Yet he continued to demand them, convinced that without constant spiritual cleansing, demons would fully possess him. His limited mental capacity made him vulnerable to suggestion, and when priests told him the demons were being expelled, he experienced temporary relief from his constant pain. It was a horrific cycle. The exorcisms were probably hastening his death, but they gave him the only comfort he knew. The final years were a slow-motion collapse. Charles's body, never strong to begin with, was systematically failing. His digestive system barely functioned. His heart was enlarged and weak. His kidneys were failing. By 1700, at age 38, Charles II looked like a man of 70. He could barely stand. He drifted in and out of consciousness. His speech, never clear, had deteriorated into incomprehensible sounds. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally died. His autopsy, preserved in Spanish archives, reveals the true cost of the Habsburg bloodline experiment. The royal physicians who opened his body were shocked into silence. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrefied. He had only a single testicle, black as coal. His head was full of water. The doctors wrote that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. They couldn't understand how he'd lived as long as he did. But perhaps most significant, Charles's bowels were described as containing only a single kidney. Modern historians believe this was likely referring to his digestive organs, which had deteriorated into an indistinguishable mass. Every system in his body had failed or was failing. Charles II wasn't just genetically damaged, he was the biological impossibility that somehow lived nearly 4 decades. With Charles's death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. No heir, no continuation. 200 years of carefully controlled marriages, of keeping the bloodline pure, of choosing power over genetic health, all of it culminated in a king so broken he couldn't produce a single child. The empire that had once dominated the known world fractured immediately. The War of Spanish Succession erupted across Europe, killing hundreds of thousands as rival powers fought over the throne Charles left empty. The Habsburgs thought they could concentrate power indefinitely by keeping it within the family. They believed their blood was so superior that mixing it with commoners would weaken it. They were catastrophically wrong. Charles II's twisted body was evolution's verdict on their strategy. Nature had rendered its judgment on centuries of genetic manipulation, and that judgment was written in deformed bones, malformed organs, and a jaw that couldn't close. Today, when we see Charles II's portraits in museums, the ones that tried so hard to make him look normal, we're looking at more than just a historical curiosity. We're seeing the physical manifestation of human arrogance, the biological consequence of believing that will and power can overcome natural law. The Habsburgs forgot that they were fundamentally human, subject to the same evolutionary forces as everyone else. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that Charles II, the most pure Habsburg, was also the most powerless. All those centuries of careful breeding had produced a king who couldn't speak clearly, couldn't eat normally, couldn't govern his own body, let alone an empire. The pursuit of genetic purity had created its perfect opposite. A ruler so broken in his biological function that he represented the complete failure of everything his dynasty stood for. The most powerful empire in Europe fell not to foreign armies or internal revolution, but to biology. The Habsburgs defeated themselves, one cousin marriage at a time, building toward the inevitable conclusion that was Charles II, the last king, the broken king, the final proof that some laws cannot be defied, no matter how much gold sits in your treasury or how many territories bear your name. And somewhere in the royal crypts beneath Madrid, Charles II's remains rest in silence, his deformed skeleton a permanent testament to what happens when humans mistake control for wisdom, when we choose power over life itself. His broken jaw still hangs open, frozen forever in that expression that terrified ambassadors and horrified courtiers. Not quite human, not quite anything else, just the final answer to a question his family should never have asked. How far can you bend the rules of nature before something breaks? The answer was always written in his bones. They just refused to read it until it was too late.